Age 31, a friendship of 5 years, nothing happened, but the replies got shorter, the reaction emojis replaced actual responses, the name disappeared from the top of the group chat suggestions, the invitations stopped requiring a follow-up because they stopped arriving. Nothing to point to, nothing to confront, nothing that would hold up as evidence in any reasonable conversation, just a feeling, accumulating, that the space they occupied had quietly been reduced. The most disorienting part wasn't the ignoring, it was the not knowing whether it was real, whether they were imagining it, whether naming it would make them look paranoid or finally honest. If you want to understand exactly why this happens, hit that like button. Welcome to Unfiltered Adulthood, where we explore the quiet shifts that reshape us. Subscribe, and let's get back to the story. It didn't arrive as an event, it arrived as a texture, a gradual change in the quality of how the room received them, so incremental it was almost impossible to locate in any single moment. The first signal was a reply time. Messages that used to come back within minutes now taking hours, not always, not dramatically, just often enough to register, just infrequently enough to be explainable, just consistently enough, across enough days, to begin producing a low-level awareness that something had shifted without being able to identify what or when. The second was the content. Full sentences becoming single words becoming emojis, emojis becoming the specific type that require nothing, that acknowledge receipt without engaging with substance, the thumbs up and the heart that close a conversation rather than continue it, that say I saw this without saying anything about what was seen. The third was the initiation. Counting backward across 6 weeks, 9 of the last 11 conversations started by them, the ratio visible only in retrospect, only once the pattern had been assembled from individual data points that had each felt, at the time, like ordinary variance. None of these signals, individually, constituted evidence of anything. That was the architecture of the experience, the specific design of slow ignoring, each component deniable in isolation, the cumulative picture only visible from a distance that required time to accumulate, time during which the slow ignoring had been actively continuing. 31 years old, 5 years of friendship, and no single moment that could be brought into a conversation and said, this is when it changed, this is what I am responding to. Just a before and an after with no visible boundary between them, just the gradual discovery that they were spending more energy maintaining something than they were receiving from it, and that the maintenance had become entirely unilateral without a conversation ever being had about the transition. The explaining away had its own momentum, busy period, going through something, this is just how some friendships ebb and flow, everyone gets quieter sometimes, it doesn't mean anything. Each explanation accurate in isolation, each one consuming another week of evidence without producing any clarity about the overall direction. 6 weeks of explaining away, 6 weeks of individually justified days, 6 weeks of a pattern that was becoming harder to justify individually, and still no single incident, still no confrontable moment, still nothing that would survive the question, but what exactly happened? The moment they almost named it, a Thursday, a group event, the friend present, the physical proximity making the distance more precise, not less, they arrived, said the expected things, received the expected response, warm on the surface, slightly shorter than it would have been a year ago, slightly less interested in a continuation. They watched it in real time, the quality of the reception. The way the conversation moved away from them naturally, without drama, without rudeness, just with a gravitational pull toward other parts of the room, other people, other exchanges, and they let it happen, stood at the edge of it, watched the room configure itself around an arrangement that didn't include them at its center. Not excluded, present, invited, technically included. Just not sought, not drawn toward, not the person anyone in that room was orienting themselves around, and the difference between those two things, between inclusion and actual presence, was the difference that had been accumulating for 6 weeks without a name. They went home that Thursday and sat with it, not the event, the texture, the specific quality of an evening spent technically inside a room while actually standing at its margin. And the question that arrived was not who did this or why, but something more uncomfortable: how long had it been this way, and how long had they been explaining it as something else? 14 days of not reaching out after that Thursday, not as a strategy, not as a test, just as the natural result of having finally stopped explaining. And the 14 days produced 2 messages from the other side, both brief, both requiring no real response, both confirming in their brevity the thing that 6 weeks of explanation had been working to obscure. The loneliest part was not the confirmation, it was the recognition that they had known for weeks, had felt it accurately from the beginning, had trusted their own perception least precisely when it was most correct. The change didn't look like confrontation. They'd considered it, assembled the sentences, imagined the conversation, concluded that a confrontation about something this diffuse would produce one of 2 outcomes, a denial that couldn't be disproved, or an acknowledgement that couldn't be taken back, and neither outcome resolved the underlying reality, which was not a misunderstanding but a preference, someone else's preference, quietly enacted over months without being stated. What changed instead was the accounting, the internal ledger that had been running the explaining away, the one that had been assigning generous interpretations to individual data points while the cumulative picture went unexamined. That accounting got updated, not dramatically, just honestly, just with the data that had been available for weeks and had been consistently underweight. The friendship was not what it had been. That was the accurate version, arrived at without drama, without accusation, without the kind of confrontation that would have required the other person to either confirm or deny something they had chosen to communicate only through accumulation. One relationship redirected. Not ended, not severed, just accurately sized, the energy investment recalibrated to match the actual return, the maintenance reduced from unilateral to proportional, the expectation updated from what the friendship had been to what it currently was. The space that freed up, the hours previously spent explaining, the mental energy previously consumed by the accounting, went somewhere else, toward relationships where the initiation ratio was different, where the reply time was not a daily data point, where the quality of reception at a group event was not something that needed to be analyzed afterward for evidence of what it meant. The slow ignoring hadn't been confronted, it had been seen, clearly, finally, without the distortion of explanation, and seeing it clearly had been sufficient to change the relationship to it from confusion to information. This is not a story about a friendship that ended. It contracted, became smaller, more accurately sized, less freighted with expectations that the current version of it couldn't meet, and within that contraction, became more honest, the interactions that remained carrying less weight because they were no longer required to compensate for the ones that weren't happening. The signal recognition improved. Not perfectly, not without error, the line between genuine variance and genuine pattern still requiring time to distinguish, but the threshold for explanation lowered, the willingness to trust the felt sense of a room increased, the automatic reach for the generous interpretation became slightly less automatic, slightly more preceded by a question about whether the generosity was accurate or just comfortable. Some relationships after that were navigated differently. A new dynamic at work, a friendship that began cooling in a familiar way, the signals arriving and being read slightly earlier, the recalibration beginning before 6 weeks of explaining away had accumulated, not with suspicion, not with the assumption of bad intent, just with a slightly more honest accounting of what the data was actually showing. The paranoia question, am I imagining this, am I being too sensitive, would this hold up as evidence? That question didn't disappear, it remained the correct question to ask, the necessary check against a pattern recognition system that could misfire as easily as it could be accurate, but it became one question among several rather than the only question, no longer automatically overriding the felt sense that had, in this case, been correct from the beginning. The most useful thing, in retrospect, was not the confrontation that didn't happen, not the clarity that eventually arrived. It was the permission to trust what had been felt before it could be proven, the recognition that perception and paranoia are not the same thing, that the body often knows before the mind is ready to name it, and that waiting for evidence precise enough to survive a reasonable conversation can mean spending months inside something that was already visible. The subtle signals you're being slowly ignored are subtle by design. And the cruelest part is that they make you doubt the one instrument accurate enough to detect them.